Either you love it or you hate it.
Hello, my name is Des, and I was
Hi,
born
my name
in
is Gianmarco.
Hello, my name is Valentina. I was born in Italy.
Дорогие друзья, добрый день, спасибо за ваш интерес к этой сессии. Первый в России университет креативных индустрий Universal University совместно с отделом культуры и образования Посольства Великобритании в Москве продолжают цикл дискуссий с международными экспертами Utalks. Первый цикл проходит при поддержке отдела культуры и образования Посольства Великобритании в Москве. И сегодня мы будем обсуждать тему звучания городов, и мы рады приветствовать гостей нашей сегодняшней дискуссии, представителей University of the Arts London, британский вуз, один из лучших арт-вузов мира по версии QA и других различных рейтингов. Газета Sunday Times назвала его университет лучшим высшим учебным заведением Великобритании, и университет был дважды признан университетом года. University of Arts – это 6 всемирно известных колледжей, в которых преподают различные предметы в рамках креативных индустрий. И самый известный из этих колледжей – Central St. Martin's, в числе их выпускников и Александр Маккуин, и Стелла Маккартни, и Джон Гальяно. И сегодня с нами директор программы пространственной практики в Central St. Martin's Алекс Уорнок-Смит и руководитель магистрской программы по городскому планированию в Central St. Martin's Диана Ибанез Лопес. И мы поговорим про архитектуру и про звучание городов. И модератором сегодняшней дискуссии является Ася Котенко, архитектор, преподаватель архитектурной школы МАРШ, одной из школ Universal University, первый в России университет креативных индустрий. Спасибо большое. Ася, передаю слово.
Добрый вечер, Дарья. Спасибо большое за представление меня и наших уважаемых гостей. And I would prefer to continue in English to be able to sort of be in the one line with our guests. And it's really a pleasure and an honor for me to be here this evening. As Daria has already introduced the guests, I think I would give the word straight to Diana and Alex, not hesitating and spending our precious time. Hello, Diana, and hello, Alex.
Thank you, Ася. It's a huge pleasure to be here. I'm going to jump straight in and just make this full screen and introduce myself. I'm the course leader for this new course at Central St. Martin's, MA Cities, and I'm also a senior curator at Create London, which is an arts organisation working outside of galleries and in Greater London and across the UK on public commissioning of art that makes a positive change to the city. I've also taught for the last 6 or 7 years in architecture and planning and in product design at a range of universities. And I've done this across scales. So whether it's been looking at kind of policies and how something like an architecture MA project then sits in the world and can become the beginning of a practice, or with the Y Factory looking at kind of global scales of urbanism and projecting kind of future cities, 50 years worth of projections of how we might understand a particular issue, such as kind of climate change or social justice on a global scale. In my work as a curator with Create London, I've been working for the last year on co-curating the 100th year anniversary of the largest housing estate in Europe. It was the largest housing estate in the world for much of the 20th century. And we're particularly interested in what social infrastructure might be, or what infrastructural commissioning might be when you think about it in terms of who it involves, whether it's kind of building playgrounds or building kind of archives and new ecological surveys of the estate. And I guess it's worth highlighting both sides of what I do and not just the academic, because at Central St. Martin's, we're really keen to ground our academic practice in real projects. Over to Alex.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name's Alex Warnock-Smith, and Ася and Daria, thank you so much for setting this situation up and for inviting myself and Diana to take part. We're really, really glad to be here. So I have the wonderful privilege of being Programme Director for Spatial Practices at Central St. Martin's, and Spatial Practices is broadly speaking, the architecture and urbanism department at the college. Like Diana, I'm both an academic as well as a practitioner, and sort of combine my teaching practice and professional practice as part of my career, and always have done. As well as Central St Martin's, I used to teach at the University of Cambridge and at the Architectural Association for the past decade, as well as at lots of other schools internationally. So on the screen at the moment is we're looking at my website for my practice, Urban Projects Bureau, which is an architecture and urban design practice based in London. We've been going for about the last sort of 9 or 10 years. We focus on the design of public buildings, urban design, meanwhile projects, questions of developing cities, and also spatial strategy and urban policy. For us, it's all about social inhabitation and political agency in all the things that we do. And we're really interested in architecture and the architectural project as the synthesis of different forces and the initiator of new beginnings. So this evening's discussion and talk is called Voices from the City. We'll be discussing what we mean by spatial practices as an expanded field of ways of engaging in space, society, and the city through collaborative and cross-disciplinary forms of pedagogic and professional practice. We'll talk about how we can use digital technology to engage multiple places, spaces, and cities simultaneously at the same time, focusing on our new MA Cities course and the ways we're doing it in that course. And Diana will share snippets of student work and academic work produced in the course, including parts of a 6-hour live radio broadcast that was curated and hosted by our students on the course. So here we are. This is Granary Square, and that's an image of the outside and the inside of the college, Central St Martin's. We're very lucky and privileged to be right in the centre of London, in King's Cross, and right bang in the centre of one of Europe's largest urban regeneration projects, which gives us a very sort of real urban regeneration context within which we situate ourselves. The college has over 4,500 students. There's over 100 different countries represented by students, and probably another 1,500 staff. Can we go to the next slide, please? So at Central St Martin's, we have these different programs which are listed here, and programs are what other colleges or universities might refer to as departments or schools. So art, performance, product and industrial, graphic communication design, spatial practices, which is us, culture and enterprise, jewelry and textiles, and fashion. I think one of the key things about the project, the greater project of the college, is that we work collaboratively and in an interdisciplinary manner between the different programs and disciplines. And we do that both on a sort of a formal, in-curricular way and on an informal way, in the sense that our spaces are designed so that there's a lot of cross-collaboration and cross-fertilization between disciplines through students and staff. And key to the pedagogy at the college, I think, is its founding roots. The college was founded by, in the arts and crafts movement, and the founder was William Letheby, who's was a very prominent arts and crafts architect. And from its foundations in the 19th century, the pedagogic ethos has been about learning through doing, co-creating, co-making, and co-practicing together. And we treat all of our students as practitioners right from the day that they enter the college. And there's an ethos of treating teaching and learning and design work as practicing together, students and staff practicing on projects together. So this is about our program, Spatial Practices. So we have 4 main courses: BA Architecture, which is an undergraduate architecture degree, MARCH, which is a postgraduate architecture degree, and both of those are professionally validated for students who want to qualify as a chartered architect in the UK. We also have MA Narrative Environments and MA Cities. Now, I think one of the key things about our program is that we're called Spatial Practices, not Department of Architecture or Department of Built Environment or something, because for us, spatial practices suggests indicates a much more expansive and open field of opportunities and approaches to practicing spatial. It's not just defined to the sort of normative categories of what an architecture teaching and learning and practice might be. For us, it's all about generating new forms of practice. That's what we're about as architects, practitioners, academics, and that's what the program is about overall. I think just to expand a little, MA narrative environments is, for example, is spatial, but it's not necessarily architectural. It's to do with narrative theory, narrative design, situation design, the museum design, curation, curatorial practices in the city. And then MA Cities, which is our newest course, and Diana is the leader of that course, is situated at the frontier of the program and hopefully at the frontier of the disciplines. And we develop the course through a lot of collaboration with external agencies, internationally and locally, from practitioners to local authorities to government bodies to community groups, to sort of shape what the need and role for a critical and creative cities-based course would be in an art school, and to promote a positioned and situated approach to designing, practicing, thinking, doing, making in the city. Next slide, please.
Your aim will be to dismantle traditional models of practice.
We aim to dismantle traditional models of practice. I couldn't say it better myself. That's one of our recent graduates, and actually the film clip is from his final graduation project, which was all filmed and part of an extended performance. It was quite groundbreaking and mold breaking for our discipline. And I couldn't say better myself that we aim to dismantle traditional models of practice. We've juxtaposed that project with an image of a book, Spatial Practices book, that we as a program produced and edited and published. It was published just last year. The book, it's available from Routledge. It has hundreds of different practitioners, academics, thinkers, contributing chapters, projects, dialogues, interviews to the book that start to discuss what spatial practices might mean, and what are the different modes of action and engagement in the city. And the book was quite a turning point for us because it collects and speculates on the last 5 to 8 years of the program, and also starts to set new agendas for the future. And the next slide, this slide is about our program manifesto. So the image on the right is our current manifesto, and the animation is of a process that we're currently going through to rethink our manifesto and establish new positions and new critical questions. So if we start with the image on the right, our manifesto as a program was developed collaboratively 5 years ago, and sets out some of the sort of key themes, approaches and ethos that we're about as a program, both as individuals, as students, as staff, and as different communities of practitioners within that. I think fundamentally we see the production of space as both social and political is very, very key to what we do throughout all our courses and projects. And also rethinking what it means to be a practitioner, to be a professional, what our role is, what the ethics of that is, and how do we practice and how do we transform and change known models and forms of practice. So we use the manifesto in many different ways. In a sense, when it was developed, it was a set of criteria that we were about and that we were working towards. I think over the last 5 years or so, it's become much more part of our DNA, and is sort of embedded or more implicit in the way that we work and the way that we talk about our work and the way that we frame things. For instance, we ask our students to and our tutors to develop positions on the manifesto. We often use it to encourage theses and count antitheses, agreement, disagreement, etc., etc. What we're doing at the moment is trying to then say, well, what's the next stage? We want to work very collaboratively together to develop new positions and critical positions that we're working towards, fundamentally positions on anti-racism, on the climate emergency, on what we've learned from the pandemic. And we're very interested in positioning ourselves in an intersectional space between these different crises and these different subjects or approaches that we're working towards. And the animation is showing a Miro board, which is a digital software and infrastructure that we're using to do that. And it's enabling lots of different communities of conversations to be happening between ourselves as staff and our students and our alumni and our wider communities of networks and friends. And as well as our academic courses and all of our academic activities, the Spatial Practices program hosts a public platform. And what we mean by public platform is basically a series of ongoing public-facing events, lectures, exhibitions, seminars, workshops that contribute to the wider cultural environment and to the wider discourse about the architecture, urbanism, spatial practices, disciplines. The images you're seeing are of Fundamentals, which was a 5 or 6 years series of public debates that we've run in the past, where we collaborated with Oliver Wainwright, who was is the architecture and cities critic for The Guardian newspaper, which is one of the main broadsheet newspapers in the UK. And with Ollie, we put together every year a set of themes and conditions that were fundamental to both society and the city and the way that we live and work and practice spatially, and brought together a broad range of practitioners, thinkers, artists, intellectuals, poets, philosophers, politicians to discuss those fundamental issues and also then follow those up with articles and further directions. And then the last thing I'll mention before I pass back to Diana, who's going to focus more on the MA Cities course, is about live projects. So as I mentioned before, the ethos of the program, and to a certain extent the college, is that we work and practice creatively together in real life sites and situations. That's key to our pedagogy. So in spatial practices, all of our students at different parts of their experience will be working on live projects, whether that's designing a new public space and public realm in Croydon, which is the image we're looking at here, which we designed with students and was then built and implemented, where the students were working directly with institutions in Croydon, with the local authority, with the planners, and with, importantly, with the community that they were developing the projects for. Or we may be working with private companies, with homeless charities, with local authorities, with political agencies to develop projects, spaces, strategies. And that's a fundamental part of what we do. And I think it illustrates the point that students and staff will be working on those things together on a combined practice. And there's an equality or equality between practitioners in that sense. MA Cities, just to sort of pass the ball back to Diana, is born into that space. And fundamentally, we believe all the things we do in MA Cities are about co-creating projects on the city, both with external partners and with our students. Over to Diana.
Hello. So in MA Cities, as Alex says, we're really interested in forms of live project. Sometimes those are collaborations with partners, sometimes those are student-led and self-directed, or a mixture of the two. But we're also interested in what it means to be teaching into and then learning in the classroom through a number of cities that our students are based in. So what does it mean to be digital? And kind of how many more spaces and how many more cities can you be involved in and working with kind of as real spaces when you're a digital classroom? With that in mind, and kind of wanting to focus in with you tonight on the pedagogical ethos and expand on that pedagogical ethos that Alex has been talking about and ways of experimenting in the digital classroom. I wanted to tell you first a little bit about the structure of the course. So we are a 2-year MA. It's targeted at mid-career professionals. This can be done alongside full-time work. It can be done alongside other projects. And the commitment is for taking a unit at a time, which can be done in 2 years or can be done across up to 5 years. So kind of joining the course and then stepping out, depending on the time commitment that you have. The reason for this is partly so that we can offer a postgraduate course alongside work. So you're not having to step out of your practice in whatever profession it is to help to either expand that practice or redirect it into kind of other ways of working in cities, but also with wider networks of professionals. Each unit focuses on a particular scale and a particular topic. So the first unit, which we're going to focus on tonight, called Voices from the City, is at the personal scale, at the scale of the voice, but also at the scale of supporting and engaging with the voice of others. So recognizing your own positionality in your practice, but also being clear about what it means to work with others, but also to study with others. We then leap up to this question of community and collaboration and really question what defining those terms mean. We then jump up one more scale to critical creative practice in response to changes in the city. So in this regeneration context, scaling up one more, looking at governance and commissioning, what it means to kind of put the idea into the world or into the profession of what a new project could be, but also what's the afterlife of that. Scaling up even more to transnational transactions, infrastructure, infrastructural questions that we faced in post-COVID in the city, but also in relation to issues such as social justice and kind of ecological questions. And then back to the voice of an individual student. What is the thesis that you want to explore for the final 6 months of this MA? In terms of the digital and of technology, in that couple of hours a week that we meet as a group, that's all done as a digital classroom. So we have, at the moment, we've got 5 or 6 cities represented in the classroom. Some students are in the same city and can meet. And then once every unit, we gather for about 20 hours of intense, over a long weekend, intense teaching, what we call a sprint, where we're able to visit sites, to collaborate also with kind of a public performance or event, a particular project, but also work together really intensely as a sort of mini think tank. So that's the context for what it means to be doing flexible learning alongside real life, but also what it means to be doing kind of to be holding a digital classroom in relation either to your work or to the city that you're based in. This is a diagram really thinking about what it means to be practicing while studying. So we talked a little bit about how every tutor on spatial practices practices while teaching, but we also consider all of our students as practitioners, and all of our guest lecturers are, of course, practitioners involved in the making of the city in some way too. So a student will be involved in placements, they will work closely with local government, they will engage with policymakers, and then they'll be involved in people that they bring as collaborators to the course or to their own projects as well. And we also encourage students to invite guests or kind of recommend kind of particular collaborations they'd like to explore. One of the ways that we explore those collaborations are through course partners. So MA Cities wants, a little bit like the students' practice network diagram, we want to create a series of transnational conversations with us, but also triangulate and be able to host, for example, a conversation with our partners Teatro Mundi, who are a interdisciplinary research group working across a number of cities in Europe and Africa at the moment predominantly. How might they triangulate with an academic partner in Brazil, and another partner we're working with, which I'll talk about in a minute, but how might they also collaborate with a specific project or a specific site? One example is the first project that we based the Voices from the City on, which is called the City Talks Back, and the website is backtalks.city. which is a kind of experimental research project and series of commissions that Teatru Mundi are running in Athens. Sound on this. I might have to talk over it. This is the website, and it collects a series of conversations, sound experiments, and collaborations with different community groups across Athens, exploring kind of what it means to be taking part in the formation of that city sonically. So inspired by this, we collaborated with Teatru Mundi to curate what we call a series of duets, kind of two voices speaking together kind of about particular cities and about a particular scale, for example, the scale of citizenship. And learning from the City Talks Back, we brought that into the classroom, and we'd have these two practitioners meet for the first time. And then we'd also have students learn about their work and present back a sound piece or a sound experiment or a response to the topic within the same classroom. So we then would meet as a first series of sessions to introduce students to the course and explore a question of, for example, citizenship rituals, limitations, challenges across practices. This is an example of the platforms we use to communicate digitally and to share reading and sound experiments. It's called Padlet, and it's possible to kind of comment on each other's work outside of the classroom, but also to share it with a wider community network and invite sound recordings directly on the page. This I've put in because it's an example of how we can also run traditional academic work in this form of kind of digital collaboration. This is a Padlet page where we've set up a reading group, and we've suggested that we divide the reading list between all the students, and then that everybody brings back a summary of a text and kind of shares it with each other, but then presents it back and comments on it. So it's kind of applying the kind of sound experiment form or sharing work to traditional forms of research and writing as a group. And we've been calling this generous research. How can you, as quite a small group with a limited amount of time, get to know each other and use the classroom as a way of together reading 20 books rather than 2 in a week? Then this is another partner. This is an architecture school based in Brazil who have been working in a similar way with part-time courses with all age groups and looking at ways of interrogating how the city is made, as well as teaching traditional forms.
Cara, sinceramente, eu não sei nem dizer direito o que é trabalho escravo, não. Eu sei que, pelo que eu passei lá, eu não quero passar de novo de jeito nenhum, rapaz.
This is an extract from a study that we did. I'm just going to pass. I'm not very good at the sound stop. On the question of modern day slavery and forced labor within the international construction industry. So they brought that to the table as part of the Teatru Mundi curated duets to begin to think about what failures might we interrogate, even from the point of view of voice and from the point of view of voicing the experience of others. And also how, as researchers, we can voice within an institution that there are these kind of global failures that our profession and the making of cities engage in. So that's an example of a longer term collaboration and research project that is able to enter the classroom, but a student can continue to engage with the partnership beyond. And then the third collaboration, which was the main piece we wanted to talk about tonight in relation to technology, is with a radio collective. They're a nomadic transnational radio station. They cross linguistic boundaries with radio shows, sometimes in the back of a van, sometimes with kind of multiple points for broadcasting and bringing in communities from, for example, kind of cutting a line across the Arctic or through the Amazon and connecting to radio shows across the world that are local and on a community level. The reason we began collaborating with them is because in a COVID context, we wanted to be able to host a full weekend of working together as a group, but we didn't want it to feel like a Zoom room. We wanted to somehow find a way to work together, to work with our hands, to work with a wider community that could still be digital. And so with Radio Espacio Estación,
live now.
We began thinking about what it meant to broadcast the very things we were talking about in the classroom to a much wider audience.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Estás escuchando Radio EE.net, un canal radial móvil y multilingüe. You are listening to Radio EE.net, a mobile, multilingual, online radio station.
So a key bit of this experiment was, what does it mean to recognize the way of speaking, but also the languages and the communities of every student that was involved in this experiment of launching a 6-hour radio show just 6 weeks into the course. And we did this in, I think we involved 4 languages. We also involved a wider community of about 50 people feeding in sound pieces and getting involved in research pieces that the students pitched to be part of the radio show. And we also began considering what the generous act of broadcasting and sharing the discussions that were held within a digital classroom could mean also to support student research. So when there's something like a half-an-hour radio slot, it's much easier to ask somebody for an interview. It's also much easier, and at the same time harder on a personal level, but much easier to state a particular position or to kind of experiment with a dialogue or a conversation or a call-in in a way that a purely theoretical project might take much longer to do. So it's another way of putting conversation about cities into the world and not just kind of built projects or spatial projects as a product into the world.
You are listening to Cities Live at radioee.net/Cities Live. Coming to you from Lahore, London, Buenos Aires,
Melbourne, Los Angeles,
Join the conversation on Twitter, #Cities Live.
And here you heard the voices of about 5 of our students in a jingle composed collaboratively by them, mainly by Khadija Kabri, whose voice you could hear as the presenter. And so as part of putting this together, students learned the technology of kind of digital broadcasting. They learned to put together a jingle. They prepared adverts for those activists and spatial practitioners they were inviting on, so that they also advertised the same projects they were studying and thought about how to frame them in 30 seconds in the world, sort of presentation practice. And then they also put together a themed program, thinking about how you might connect, for example, an Argentinian feminist activist with another in Bangladesh and another in Lahore. Like, what does it mean to have a conversation about being a woman in the city, across cities, in 10 minutes? Kind of, who do you bring? What topics do you bring up, and what do you connect it to? So this, for example, is a snapshot of about half an hour of the 6 hours. And we had a collaboration between a student in Buenos Aires and Lahore. And then we had another collaboration with Yorgos Samantas, who is an urban ethnographer working with sound in Athens, thinking about processes of protest through sound and how you kind of make evident the popular voice on the ground. So then there was a discussion. There was a thematic link between those discussions, much as you might put together in an essay, but here in a radio show. And this is looking a glimpse into the classroom of what it means to run a space like this, what it means to plan rather than a lecture, to plan a show, kind of how much you have to pre-prepare and how much as a group you work collaboratively. In here we're seeing the grid to kind of put everything together, but also to communicate in kind of when to speak and how to time entries and collaborations and support and interruptions. So now, for example, I could be doing this to Alex and he would know to jump in, that I was kind of running out of things to say. Here on screen, you can also see Stephanie Sherman, who is part of the Radio E Collective and also the course leader for MA Narrative Environments. And this is another example of how we work collaboratively across Central St. Martin's, across topics and across different forms of spatial practice. And here I wanted to end on another element of seeing the classroom, kind of seeing us all celebrate, even in a Zoom room, how much kind of connection and joy there was, and how much we were also connected through video to our technician in Buenos Aires. But also just to say that this was a moment that really brought us together. We'd never met in person, but by the end of this 6-hour experiment or 3 days worth of programming leading up to it, we really knew how we thought and how we wanted to research far more than we might have done with a series of PowerPoint presentations or even speculative design projects. And it's allowed us then to continue working collaboratively in the classroom through generous research, through shared positions, and through debates, by kind of expanding through technology, kind of connecting to as many people as possible, and then learning about ourselves as a classroom. Nearly there. It's our jingle again, and here are the details. If you'd like to listen to the show, you've got the 5
Hola, hello. This is the first MA Cities cohort from Central St. Martin's. We've teamed up with Radio Espacio Estación, Radio Space Station, and Teatro Mundi to present Cities Live. Lahore, London, Buenos Aires. Lahore, and the state of Canada, Buenos Aires, London. A unique transmission featuring live conversations, recordings, music, and sounds about the complexities, challenges, and joys of our urban settings. Escucha en vivo por radioee.net/cities live. Listen live at radioee.net/cities live. Hora de Londres, 12 a 18 horas.
Just switch that. You're able to listen back on radioee.net/cities live.
What's happening in your city? In the 7 sacred indigenous islands, home of the Koli peoples, what is now called Bombay or Mumbai, Akitami is working with Sister Library, a project that brings together readers to explore the literary contribution, showcase the artistic quality, and celebrate the contribution of women in the creative world, as well as fostering interest in and understanding of the accomplishments of women writers and artists. You can support them by how? Celebrating women. To find out further information or to get in touch, please visit milaap.org/fundraisers/sister-library or follow them on Instagram at sister.library.
So that was an advert. It could equally have been an essay opening, and it's kind of a student giving back a radio advert to platform one of the contributors to the duet sessions. But also as a way of kind of condensing knowledge and thinking about how you describe a practice such as Sister Library, a feminist library in one of the densest slums in the world, how that gets described in relation to its cities and to how you describe a city. Sort of self-evident. It's almost odd to describe an advert that's so clear. But I find it very interesting to have both kind of MA level kind of thinking and writing, and a product that can be public and that can continue to feed into the real projects that are happening. That's it, really. I think this is the point at which we say, any questions, anything that wasn't clear or anything you'd like to explore with us.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Alex. That was really super interesting and very inspirational for me as an academic professional, as a tutor here in Moscow. And before continuing to the questions from our audience, I have several questions just from my side. I would like to know if this radio show project, was it the thesis of your MA program, or was that a research that they did before going into the thesis?
It's almost 2 years before the thesis. It was their first 6 weeks. So we welcomed our first cohort, and it was the first intensive teaching weekend. So we thought, especially because we couldn't get together because of COVID, we thought, how can we make a space that's as close as possible to being in person, or to really working together and getting to know what you tend to learn from other people when they're stressed or in the corridor or between sessions. And I knew about this radio collective and how they were beginning to use it, not just to work with communities and across languages, but also to bring that kind of work into universities. And I thought that would be a perfect way to cross linguistic boundaries, city boundaries, but also to introduce this, our first cohort, which is really very small. We're 8 professionals together and plus the tutors, how to get all of this to come together, really work together, but face out, to think about kind of how these discussions about cities, which we feel are really relevant today, are relevant literally today, are relevant kind of in the world and in the cities that we're talking about, not just studying them, but kind of speaking back to them, allowing call-ins, inviting comment on the discussion. And so it served as the first research project as students began to set the question that they might explore through the whole MA. And then they could do that, for example, through interviews, or for example, by collecting a series of sound recording answers to a question and then producing them into a radio show. It's kind of almost how you would begin to collect the evidence for mapping evidence for a project, or reference evidence for an essay.
All right.
And Alex, do you want to add anything?
Maybe I could just expand it. I think the way the course is structured is we do 1 unit of study at a time, and each unit lasts about 10 weeks. It's the length of a term. And the course is designed that each unit produces a project on the city together, so with an external partner. So as well as students receiving knowledge, exchanging knowledge, writing papers, etc., there's a propositional element, and in this unit 1, that was doing the radio show with Radio EE, and it was all developed with Teatro Mundis or external partners. So I think that's quite fundamental to the course, that we should be producing a new project on the city every 10 weeks. It also sits within our sort of broader pedagogic ethos of practicing together and also producing live projects as a form of academic practice. I think the other thing with talking about the radio show was the position of it within the unit. So the students had been with us for 6 weeks, as Diana had said. And during those 6 weeks, we're entering into these duets or dialogues with practitioners from around the world, and students were responding creatively to those practitioners' work and practices and sharing with them. And that was a process of that process was reinforced or sort of supported by decolonizing practices, where we were thinking about how do we as practitioners and students share our positions and start to understand our own positionality. And then the radio show was an amazing way, as Diana said, to look outwards, to then prepare for that, having gone through that process, and start to compose pieces and dialogues and discussions that go live back into and out to the world at large.
I mean, maybe one more thing to add. In a sense, it was a welcome. It was creating that sense of community and collaboration between us, but it was also a welcome to an art school. No one had run a radio show. I think only one person had done sound pieces before. So that collaboration was also around, you know, I'm very good at what I do in my professional life. Let's test something completely new. And so the generosity is not just about the broadcasting, but it's about what we'd maybe call unlearning, what we'd maybe call multidisciplinarity, what we'd maybe call kind of experimental approaches to early research, but actually it's quite, to really do all those things, it's quite a kind of a slight bump of terror. And then the satisfaction of having stepped out of your professional, often very controlled spaces in which you feel you're a professional, and then asking those questions in another medium. And that medium could have been anything. It could have been dance and performance. It could have been fully word-based. It could have been design. It really could have been anything. But the radio show felt like a way sufficiently alien to us all and sufficiently generous to kind of shake us all into a new space, kind of art school production.
Thank you for your answer, and that sounds. And I'm super curious about learning what are going to be sort of the projects led after such a start, right? When you're like changing the way you think about your work and about your studies and about what are you planning to do in your academic field, right? So I'm going to continue to the questions from our audience, and here is the first question. I think it has two parts, so I will read them both. How do you think the city can change by the knowledge of how it sounds? And the second part of it is, for example, during the pandemics, the cities were empty, and how, based on that knowledge and on the sound that it was making by itself, being empty, can change the city architecture?
Can I take the first one?
Yeah.
Well, I think we really believe that the systems that you perpetuate and you work with continue to make the world around us. So we see city making as, from the point of view of practice, as based also on how we read it, not just how we write it, and how we listen to a city. So one thing can be to talk about kind of the voices of others and being kind of fully aware of how, whether it's kind of a protest space or whether it's how we express hope, fear, what we call places, who we talk to when we're discussing a particular space. All of this is going to shape our worldview, but also how we design. And so I think it's really on us to challenge the spaces and the tools with which we're comfortable, including the spaces of listening, and to actively look for new ways of listening and of dialogue in a practice that can be, you could have absolutely incredible design skills, but there can be a risk of there being an institutional or a professional monologue. So kind of beginning to look for dialogue. So I think that challenging how we listen or who we might discuss a topic with, kind of breaking the boundaries of your classroom or your institution or your profession, will help us design or make or commission really differently. As an example, we had a researcher who had trained as an architect teach into the first unit. I've not talked about her work here, but she said something at one point. She said, I just realized a few years into being an architect that I really needed to learn to speak other professions like I speak other languages. And I think equally kind of listening to the city sounds both slightly mad and is really revelatory, because we navigate also by listening. It's fully wired into how we hear and feel and respond to a space. But we often separate that quite kind of haptic bodily feeling from how we practice. So that's one answer. I'm sure there are others. Alex.
Thank you. And
should I try and address the second part of the question, which, if I understand rightly, Ася, was to do with the city as a space that was quite silent and empty during the pandemic, and then the potential impact of sound and voice on the architecture of the city. So I think to start with, the intention of the unit that the radio took place in was to share voices from the city. The unit's called Voices from the City. And when we developed the course over the last few years, before we started teaching it, the intention of the first unit was for students and invited practitioners from around the world to bring cities with them and bring their practice with them and to share that. And what we wanted to address or understand was how different jurisdictions of practitioners in different situations around the world are dealing with common themes, common challenges, political challenges, climate, environmental challenges, all sorts of things within their city and their practice in a situated manner. And the point of the unit was for practitioners and students to articulate their own practice and their own experience in response to global issues. And I think behind that was also an understanding of all cities being lots of cities at the same time and all being connected. And there was what we were trying to achieve was a balance between an understanding of local and particular conditions, and then the universality of the global condition of all cities and the sort of networks and systems that we're all part of, that are produced by cities and are act upon cities. I think then COVID is one of those experiences. So although we weren't in the streets and in the cities, it was an experience in the city that most people in most cities around the world were going through together. And although we weren't outside in the spaces, we were all in the city experiencing it simultaneously and in very different and particular conditions and ways. So in many ways, it highlighted or accentuated both that sort of local, positional, particular experience in a very intense manner, but also this sense of sharing and going through it together. I think also the understanding that what one community or city may be experiencing at one time is going to affect people and communities and cities and spaces at the other side of the globe, and that they're interconnected. I think the role of the radio then, and of literally taking voice, or the idea of voices in the city, from that of being the voice of your practice and your experience to being literally the voice that you use to communicate with. The radio enabled us to do that, and what we hoped to do was to create a dialogic space, but almost a space of exchange that was from people in different cities talking about their experiences at the same time. So we wanted the radio show to become almost its own city, where voices, spaces, experiences were communicated and shared. Whether that has an effect on, a literal effect on architecture and buildings, I'm not so sure, but I think that it will continue to have an effect on the sort of cultural understanding of the city and the ways in which we as citizens live and dwell in the city and communicate with one another, and the way that we practice. And at a very base level, it was also about people exercising their voice and practicing their voice and having a voice and being able to continue that dialogue across cities and terrains. I'm pretty sure that will have an effect, a big effect, on the way we understand the city and think of cities and think of spaces and our roles in it, even if it doesn't have a literal effect on the physicality of buildings. It probably will do on the perception of them and the cultural understanding of them.
As a quick example of what we might listen for when we're stripping away the visual, students went out into the city and thought about particular topics purely through audio, which actually removes the instinct to kind of photograph or video or design. And at first, of course, this feels like a very strange challenge, but what came back were a series of audio recordings around the spaces in between and kind of where you do or don't find conversation in the COVID context, kind of where fears are held, what scale loneliness is held at, you know, are there the right kind of spaces in a particular city for a particular kind of encounter. So there was one piece around loneliness in Geneva as a response to having heard about other spaces for interaction in other cities through these through the audio pieces that different students were bringing to the table. So in a sense, it isn't always listening to the literal sound of the city, but it's through that process of research, kind of listening to your own, like what you find can be more open when you don't default to sort of a form of framing that you're very comfortable in producing.
All right, yeah. So I think that this is actually the way you continued the question, Diana, is probably leading us to the next question, because it is about the difference between the cities. And So the author of the question proclaims that all the cities sounds different, but is there anything common within all of them?
Cool. We didn't listen to all of them. We just touched about 10. I mean, I think the one show, which was called Two Women, I can't remember how many, 4,000 miles, that came out 9,000 miles, Two Women, 9,000 miles. Don't know how many kilometers that is. Probably about 1,400 kilometers. That came out of a commonality that hadn't necessarily been expected. And it was about the lived experience of mothers with young children and kind of ways of walking through the city while doing these sound experiments. I suspect that the commonality there is partly through the practitioner doing the work, and that it could be replicated across cities and non-cities possibly in the world. But I'm thinking about answering the question, was there a commonality across the sound of all cities? I think all of them could be communicated without images. Maybe. Alex?
Well, I think there's definitely, again, back to the sort of intentions of the exercise is to understand what's shared, what are the shared conditions that cities around the world are facing, the challenges, for instance, climate, for instance, pandemic, and then how are they experienced in the particular local conditions, and how do we respond to that? And I think in framing it in that way, that gives life to and reinforces the particular qualities or sounds, if you like, of particular cultural identities in particular cities. So again, to use Diana's example of a dialogue between a female practitioner in Lahore and a female practitioner in Buenos Aires about common issues and common themes and common approaches, but the sounds that they're conveying, or the experiences they're conveying through sounds, and through images and things that we used elsewhere in the course, convey the particular cultural conditions, the differences, the distinctions, the distinctiveness of those particular places. And I think that sort of understanding of global challenges, or the effects of globalization, and the particularities of place and space and individual practice is the sort of positionality of the course, or probably I would say of the program and the college as a whole. And so using sound to give shape to that and form to that was really, really important.
I'd like to take this in one more direction, which is one of the last pieces, if you do listen back in the final section, was called The Cities We Carry Within Us. And it was by one of the students, it was a research project by one of the students thinking about this question of how the cities, and often the many cities that have helped form, that we've listened to and have helped form how we look, are present in kind of, when we summarize kind of what cities help us see other cities, we can all describe kind of what it is we took from each. And in that sense, those cities are in each of us very, very differently. It sounds esoteric and a bit mystical, but the research project actually brought back some really clear, succinct answers on, like, this is the essence of this city and this is why it influences how I live in a different city, which I think is a really lovely approach to what it is to first think about your own voice and your own way of looking before you begin looking at others, or looking at, issues of global policy and climate change.
Right. I think it's very relevant, as everyone is putting their own personal framework on whatever they do or whatever they practice. So this is like a prefab sort of thing that goes before anything as a base. And the next question from the audience is, I think, was partly answered, but still I will read it in the whole. Were there any changes, and what were the discoveries while students were listening to the city while it was empty during pandemic, and then living its normal active life? And did the appreciation of the city, did this discovery change after they did this project, after they did this live radio show? So how did they change with that?
I mean, go for it.
I was going to start with a bigger point, then maybe you follow on with a more specific point. But I think in terms of a bigger point, one of the biggest observations of all of us, I think, when the city became empty, was of nature and of the absence of the noise or the pollution or the buzz or the things that used to fill our daily lives. And then I think particularly with our students, and not just in this course, but in sort of academic or creative discourse in general, an understanding and a sort of appreciation through a more lived experience of nature and by association the environment and then the non-human. We used to talk about the non-human in cities and our role with it and things in a slightly more abstract sense, but suddenly I think it became much more palpable for all of us. And in the students' work, one of the early clips before the introductions was a piece that starts to talk about that. There's birds chirping, there's just recordings of sounds, and the background is of the non-human, and then the human starts to, you hear voices and things as a secondary narrative on top of that, rather than always being the primary narrative. And I think the non-human and our relationship to the non-human and to the natural world is something that is sort of suddenly feels much closer to us, rather than being a sort of thing that we know we need to deal with and understand, but we don't know how. It sort of feels a little bit more palpable. And I can see it being much more present in students' work and thoughts, and that's very exciting. We don't know exactly where we'll be going with that. And I think the final point of that is that then it really starts to question, well, what is human? Particularly for us in our program and our courses, where we're all about social and political engagement, designing for people to feel empowered, to know how to act, to emancipate people, to enable people's voice. Then I think that sort of extending to say, well, then what is the role of the person, and what do we mean by society? What is human, and what are cities there for, and how are they composed? And I find that terribly exciting. That wasn't something that we could predict. But I think it sort of feels like sluice gates have opened, or there's a sort of new avalanche of awareness and thought that's kind of cascading upon us, and we're sort of trying to get to grips with. I don't think we would have done that so quickly or in such a sort of palpable or felt or experienced way if we haven't all been through the pandemic and experienced the silence of the city that the person asking the question is speaking of. Over to you, Diana.
I was going to refer to the same project, and in very specific terms of kind of a student with an architecture background coming in thinking about climate, but also thinking about society and thinking about dialogue, and then using this listening and sound production exercise to ask a more specific question that could take months to kind of answer, but is already beginning to reposition how she works as a designer and as someone kind of working kind of locally on projects in relation to the non-human and to what a dialogue might be with the non-human rather than a monologue. And maybe this is also why I had this kind of question of directionality of listening and speaking on my mind, because I'm in this ongoing conversation around this project, around what a dialogue can be. So I'll just play the piece again.
My name is Stairs. And
Hi, my name is Gianmarco.
Hello. My name is Valentina. I was born in Italy.
Marginalized citizens can have a footing to demand equal rights and entitlement.
So this is a composite of about 5 different students' work, but you hear the chirping at the beginning was a contribution to the duet on citizenship and onto this question of what it means to belong in an urban setting. And that being kind of the most audible change on the street and in a form of belonging in our urban experience. which is a really lovely approach to the topic as well.
Thank you. That's really beautiful and sounds beautiful and brings a lot of associations, apart from, I think, the directness of the images that we sort of got used to now. I mean, because we give us direct messages, not leaving us any space to sort of think and reflect upon. And the next question is, did you have an idea, like a pre-thought idea, to use this project to ask the local authorities or to propose local authorities some changes within the city infrastructure, or probably you are planning to do that?
I hadn't thought about that with radio. I like it. I think I'll borrow that. We do have real projects in collaboration with local authorities in a later unit, looking at commission and collaboration, and also looking at critical creative practices and how you support kind of struggling infrastructure in the city, kind of struggling social infrastructure and forms of creating equality. Sorry that that's vague, but, you know, community centres closing down, how might a project that's transdisciplinary begin addressing that? It isn't just policy, it isn't just funding, it isn't just what its use is and how that connects to pressing issues. It's a kind of triangulation of all of these, and it's very likely to be a collaborative pitch. But I hadn't thought of doing that with radio, and that's one maybe to think through.
I think, but on a slightly larger scale, absolutely yes. I think the intention of the course is to collaborate and make change on local authority level and international sort of governmental level. I think, like I mentioned before, when we designed the course, we spent a few years working with different local authorities, government agencies, transport authorities, but also international organizations like UN World Habitat and Cities Alliance, things to sort of frame what was the role of this course and what do people need. And we always felt, and I think particularly from Diana and my own perspectives and backgrounds of teaching cities courses in other universities, where there's a wealth of knowledge and practice in a sort of socioeconomic or geopolitical perspective, and also from sort of planning perspective. We were very keen to question what the role of a more creative pedagogy might be. What's the role of a cities course in an art school? And I think through that dialogue with local authorities or with government agencies and practices and things at different scales and internationally, we started to get there about the sort of situated perspective and about the role of culture and cultural interpretation and creative interpretation of place and space and things. That's very, very important. And from the perspective of many of the organizations we spoke to, that's what they find hardest, because that's the sort of thing that's missing, whether it's working on a sort of development level on informal settlements in the global south, or whether it's working on, like Diana was talking about, sort of social infrastructure in a city in North England, or working on transport infrastructure with a transport agency. Understanding how those things respond to and interact with and support certain social but also cultural understandings and disciplines, there's a sort of a bit of a gap there, and we wanted to develop the course into that gap to start to sort of fill it and understand it. So I think it's absolutely the intention that that the course is situated there, and that it might start to open up opportunities for more combined forms or more creative forms of spatial practice within the city that don't necessarily fall into one of the sort of known, more normative, more stable positions of what an urban practitioner might be. The other thing that we've underplayed, but that Diana was talking about or mentioned earlier, is that the course is designed for a wider demographic of graduate student to undertake it than a sort of more standard course. So it's part of a pedagogic project in the college to reach out to people who are in practice, who may be mid-career, maybe in their 30s or 40s or 50s, and have life experience and an established career or practice elsewhere. So part of the design is that, say, government agencies or local authorities might have their staff undertake the course as part of adding to the sort of skills and intellectual development of them within their current roles in the local authority. And there's a series of local authorities that we're working with in that way. We're really interested in that as well as a new sort of institutional overlap or creating new forms of practice that's both academic or an academic partnership and a local authority partnership, and how that might start to form new institutionalities or new institutional forms that might exercise practice on the city in lots of different ways.
Really practically, by being in partnership with local authorities, but also with research groups internationally, students are able to develop potentially thesis projects, but also projects within a unit that can test new forms, that can answer existing problems, that can work with existing structures. But because it's their speculative kind of student work, but as fully fledged practitioners and professionals, they can then test that, and we're hoping that will then continue into projects that grow as they graduate. They kind of continue with these projects and continue with this network of collaborators that they've met through the course. So maybe it's also worth underlining that it's a part-time course, so a lot of it is self-directed and quite compressed, but in every single session we aim to introduce the students to at least one new international practitioner and one idea of how to look at the city. So it's also like over a couple of years a way of kind of traveling all of the continents in terms of ideas and also in terms of growing an address book, put very bluntly.
All right, I see. So if I get you right, so the students, they do work with real people, I mean, with real persons from those local authorities or policymakers or city planners, not only learning through, I don't know, reading all this mess of documentation and policies and etc. And how do those, and all those people are invited by you as course leaders, or students are allowed to sort of, I don't know, find someone locally, for example, I don't know, I'm from India and I need to, and I'm making a local project, not a project in London, right? So like, while teaching from you.
Yeah. Even the practitioners that come into the classroom, they're invited by us, but students can also propose and can also say, I'm particularly interested in the development of nightclubs in Berlin. Is there space for that in one of the units, for example?
Thank you. So since we don't have any more questions from the audience, and I don't really know if we have a few more minutes, I have maybe the last question from myself, which would be, so do you believe in the sort of evolution of the perception, because the topic that you've highlighted today by this research project of the radio show is really very relevant to me, since I was researching a lot about like the evolution of how people perceive the information, and it was like in I don't know, multiple researchers said that we went from listening, from audible perception, then to writing and understanding the letters and the text. And since about a century ago, we are more like the image perceptors, right? And we live in the world of images. And today, for example, with this project, you introduce us sort of to a next step, which I've really heard about and read about, that we would probably go sort of further, but back, as everything is in a cycle, to the audible perception more. And which from my side, and that's what you've both told several times, that it asks us for more attentive learning, for more attentive research, rather than using the images, the drawings, I don't know, the video and everything, which gives us the information per se, rather than listening to the information. So what is your what are your thoughts about that?
I want to slightly bend the question and plug the current live project in the unit we're teaching at the moment around community and collaboration. We're really interested in defining those terms and looking at the word alongside images of the city and thinking about how we might expand a definition or pull it apart or challenge the way it's used by having that word in conversation with very specific spaces that show examples, for example, of hope or of fear or of manipulation or of community. So it's in I'm not answering the question about audio yet, but I'll come back to that. I think for us on the course, it's about using different tools, exercising them, and expanding our mind, and at the same time unlearning, which I think are really linked. To kind of expand, we have to kind of break out of what we're comfortable with. So we spent, the first couple of months of the year getting really comfortable with audio, and actually audio in relation to video, as you could see in this clip. So stepping only into audio and then making the composite again. I think those transitions are really vital. And then in this next unit, as we think about generous research and traditional forms of reading and writing, we wanted to question the basic building block of that. What's the meaning of a word? Does it translate in different ways to other languages? I was in a conversation this morning with a researcher, French-Algerian researcher who's been doing some work in Ethiopia. And she said that there, the word for kitchen, so architecture is taught in English, actually has a translation into 3 different forms of domestic space in Amharic. And so actually when she began interrogating the space designed into the architectural plan of what kitchen is, she discovered this kind of multiple meaning. Because the plans hadn't fully made sense to her. And I think it's in this transition between mediums and in what you call kind of stepping back to step forward that we can really push ourselves into discomfort zones. We can't always control sound. We don't always know how to do a particular thing. We might say it wrong. And it's in that saying wrong, but also recognizing that sometimes definitions or images or a particular tool become very kind of heavy with the way they've been used before, and we should question them. But Alex, do you have anything in response to the actual question about audio?
No, I agree with you, Ася, and I think it's been a learning experience for me as well through going through this first unit in MA Cities. I think the precision that's there and also the generosity that's afforded by just speaking and listening and responding, and also the timing of your thoughts and things is very different to if you're communicating on screen, sort of as we are now, or if you're all in person, or if you're using a million images to describe a project. And I think that sort of editing process and precision process can make things a lot more pure. I also think that it was also intentional in that sense to get something deeper and more shared, and less all about everything all the time, and therefore not necessarily so deep or so precise. I think there's also a bigger project going on a larger scale, sort of culturally and professionally, about listening and how we listen to one another. And across the college, I find, to use one example, we're all engaging in lots of listening workshops and listening training. Like, how do we actually hear what people are saying, particularly in a very mixed and multilingual and multicultural professional and academic environment? How do we really listen and interpret and understand and respond to one another? And that takes time. It's almost like we need to be learn to listen again. And I think that also back to I really liked the questions before about the silence in the city. I think that was something we all started to hear or feel, was the ability to listen, or the need to listen, to be able to connect with one another once again. And somehow the sort of silence brought by the pandemic slightly enabled that, or again, at least for me and many of the people I'm working with, made that need or that learning a little bit more palpable and a bit more experiential. And we're not by any means on our own in it. It's interesting listening a lot to the BBC, for example. There's lots of listening projects. There's lots of audio experiments with people talking about the pandemics, and podcasts and all sorts of things that have become incredibly important, and much more people engage with them much more than the visual. I think that's partly because we're all online now, so we're all used to just sort of spending the whole day looking at your face on the screen, and then you can't stand the idea of looking at the screen anymore in the evening, so you retreat to the audio. But I don't think it's just a reductive thing. I think actually that ability to sort of focus on listening and then contributing to something that's a dialogue is emerging again, and is quite powerful. It could be quite transformational, even if that's just on a personal level about how you think and how you listen and how you formulate ideas. So again, I think that and the non-human are really interesting sluice gates or new sort of lines of inquiry that we might all be entering into, and I find that very exciting.
Thank you. That sounds really very deep and specific. I mean, just the whole thing, and it was really a pleasure for me to sort of co-host together with just being a part of Universal University this evening. And since there are no more questions from the audience, I would like to greatly thank you both, Diana and Alex, for being with us tonight and for ending up this session. I think I will give the word back to Daria.
Ася and Daria, it's been an absolute pleasure and really stimulating conversations as well around what it means to be engaging with technology in a new way and in spatial practices. So it stimulated some really good reflection with us as well.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed the session, and hopefully we can have more interactions in the future.
Yeah,
thank you so much for this very exciting session from our side as well. And we really hope that we will have more opportunities for mutual joints, projects and collaborations. And I would like to switch to Russian. Итак, спасибо большое за то, что вы были сегодня с нами. Хотела бы напомнить, что первый в России университет креативных индустрий Universal University совместно с Отделом культуры и образования Посольства Великобритании в Москве организовал эту дискуссию в рамках цикла Utalks, и мы надеемся, что вы сможете посещать другие наши сессии, которые мы тоже скоро анонсируем. Спасибо вам большое.